My friends, welcome. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and the oil shipments out dropped to zero at the beginning of March, we collectively witnessed the tide go out to sea. Now everything seems peaceful still. There's food on the shelves and there's gas at most of the stations still. But what remains imperceptible to most people is that there is now a tsunami of crises rapidly approaching. When those tsunamis arrive depends on where you are, depends specifically on when the last of those shipments actually arrive at their ports of destination. Over the weekend, JP Morgan gave everyone a sense of what that timeline looks like when they noted that Asia and Africa will be receiving the last of their shipments by April 1st, Australia as well. Europe will receive the last of the Middle East oil by April 10th, and the US has a little bit longer until tax day, until April 15th, before the last of those energy shipments out of the Middle East arrive. Now, there's also a little bit of a buffer in terms of national reserves, which, in fact, the International Energy Association has demanded countries release to try and forestall this crisis just by a little bit more time. But it won't matter, because there's no amount of reserves that can hold a candle to the drastic reduction in supply that's just happened. In fact, to get a sense of how big that is, if you think back to Corona and just how extreme an impact that had on our lives, people basically locked up at home, working from home, travel drastically reduced, that was a tremendous amount of impact on people, and yet that only reduced the energy demand by roughly 8 million barrels per day. The supply shortfall that we're seeing now is roughly double that. That means that there is no set of policy decisions that could possibly hold a candle to what's gone on now. They could lock us down and call it an energy lockdown just as hard as they did during COVID. They could tell us to ration our gas at the pump and only use roads on days that end in the license plate. They could any of the stuff that they're talking about, and it's just not going to matter. We are going to feel the pain of these crises, and that is by design. Because when people are in pain, they will more readily accept the technocratic solutions that are being proposed, that have been talked about for a long time under the guise of deep adaptation. And lest you forget, let me remind you that these climate cultists, who are now the ones running the response to this energy crisis, have recommended such crazy things as genetically engineering tiny humans that will have a smaller carbon footprint, making people allergic to meat so that we can get rid of ranching, killing off everyone's pets because we don't need those carbon footprints. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I am saying that it is entirely reasonable, given the size of the supply shortfall that we're now facing, that the policy decisions we see in the near future are just as unimaginable today as what happened during COVID was before the pandemic. So yes, naturally, the first order effects are already happening. The price of diesel, of all fuels, is going through the roof. As a response, Maersk has added a fuel surcharge to the cost of shipping. Remember that eliminating shipping was part of that decarbonization agenda. The price of jet fuel in Europe has more than doubled in just the last month. May I also remind you that eliminating all air travel was part of that decarbonization agenda. But it's not just fuel prices, right? There are a number of second order and so on and so forth effects from this that are nigh impossible to imagine because energy touches everything. In fact, one such vector is chicken feed, which, because it depends on sulfur, which depends on the production of LNG, which is offline because Qatar, so on and so forth, there are now already chicken feed manufacturers who are raising the red flag and saying, hey, we're having trouble with our supply chain. We can't get sulfur, and that means we're not able to produce chicken feed. It's crazy to think that chickens eat oil, but of course, so do we, and a lot of it. And I'm not just talking about the fertilizer that we can't make because we don't have the LNG. I'm also talking about the fact that, for example, in Europe, the number one exporter is the Netherlands of food. And that's because of those massive greenhouses that basically turn energy into food. So we're reading from Reuters here that the Dutch gas storage levels are at a historic low of 5.8% of capacity. They're running out of gas. There's not a refill coming in right now. And yes, these massive greenhouses require LNG to heat, and then of course require energy to keep them running and for the artificial lighting and so forth. You cut the energy, and all of a sudden, the number one exporter of food in Europe drops completely offline. The same is true, as I've been covering in my recent reports, of fishing. A lot of the EU fishing fleet is completely grounded right now because they can't afford the price of diesel to go out in their boats. So fish is disappearing from the menu. The number one exporter isn't going to be able to grow food anymore. This is rapidly, we don't have to wait for the decreased yields from the impact of not having urea, which would come at the end of this season. We're going to feel very real food impacts quite immediately here. It's telling, actually, that, and remember the timeline from JP Morgan, we've already seen lockdowns and some insane policy decisions out of a lot of Asia, and even discussions of rationing in Australia. But now, Europe, who has, 10 more days to get to before their tsunami hits, just today, Brussels actually said, hey guys, we're going to need to cut down on that travel thing. They said Europeans need to consider traveling less to avoid energy shortages. The European Commission is asking member countries to consider cutting back on oil and gas use, especially in the transport sector, because we're now expecting a prolonged disruption to energy supplies. This is graduating from a price problem to an all-out energy supply crisis with serious implications. But the food is particularly concerning. As one commentator said, the war's most dangerous cascade, it's not the oil prices or the carrier deployments or the AWACS. It's that invisible line that runs from the Iranian missile to the Qatari gas field to the Bangladeshi fertilizer field to that rice paddy that feeds 1 billion people. You close those things down, and the food supply of South Asia is now operating on a countdown that no military operation, and again, no set of policy decisions can reverse it. We are now on this timeline. And of course, that's why they're calling it the Trump food crisis. It's not just food, though. Briefly, we'll mention, I mentioned in yesterday's report that plastics is a huge issue, that 22% of the world plastics supplies transit the Strait of Hormuz. Prescription drugs are also at risk in the U.S., which gets 54% of its generic prescription drugs from India, which needs the LNG to manufacture those drugs. That's now at risk. And so Reuters is warning people that this could be a problem, but they quickly add, don't be worried about your medications. Most people have a 30 to 60 day supply on hand so that we can withstand disruptions. But again, that's just a buffer. And we just heard the European Commission say this is now becoming a prolonged crisis. Now, that situation is not going to be helped by the fact that Iran just struck this industrial facilities in Israel. Among them was one of the largest plants of Teva Pharmaceutical Industries, which the U.S. also imports. So actually APIs, pharmaceutical ingredients, and drugs are very much at risk right now. So bear that in mind. Now, Australia and New Zealand are unique in that they really have very little reserves. When the crisis began, and now they're rapidly burning. They're going to be some of the most immediate and most severely impacted, and they may be a test bed to see how people respond. Here's a site, nzoilwatch.com, which has both an Australia and a New Zealand tab on it. It's a very cool site that lets you get this real-time countdown of how many days of fuel these countries have left. So here on the Australia tab, we see that there's 24 days of jet fuel left, and only 27 days before the diesel completely runs out. Now, of course, there's already gas stations. We've been hearing that farmers are already not able to get what they ordered. That's why they're not planting new winter crops, and they're not able to harvest the crops that are coming out at the end of the season. But even given all of the rationing, in fact, down here at the bottom, it describes the series of policy responses that could be taken and gives you a sense of how much impact they would have. But like I said at the beginning, the supply shortfall is so extensive that there is no set of policy rationing or drawing down reserves, for putting refinery maintenance off until the future. And it doesn't matter. You can't stop what's going to happen. You can slow it down by 25%, but that only buys you a few more days. So I thought these numbers were pretty crazy, and I'll put a link to these sites because it's a good resource to have as a real-time glimpse at just how, this is it. This is the countdown to the arrival of these tsunamis, and Australia and New Zealand are very much at the forefront here. Now, there's been a lot of conflicting media coverage, so in my last video, I asked people to reach out to me and let me know what they were seeing. Send me an email at iceagefarmer@protonmail.com. Here is one picture that was sent to me by a viewer of one of the pumps in New South Wales where gas is being limited, as you can see here at the pumps. And they also wrote that people are, that theft has begun. People are siphoning gas out of heavy equipment and out of trucks that are parked overnight. They wake up to have their gas tanks completely empty. So that's already indeed happening. On the New Zealand front, the situation is not much better. They do have 49 days, a bit more. They do have 49 days of diesel. And the government is already talking about how they're going to respond to this energy crisis. It's not lost on the people that wrote me that it was very recently that the government instituted a digital ID there too. Smells a lot like the EU digital wallet, which is being rolled out this year in 2026. It's called this New Zealand government app, which will provide a secure and convenient way for New Zealanders to access key services. It's modeled on an international example because this is a global agenda. And will be used for a mobile driver's license. So they're putting out the infrastructure like the rest of the world rapidly, which can be used for this kind of digital ID-based rationing of energy and ultimately of food, storing digital ID credentials and receiving direct government communications. That's why they're rolling this out so quickly, is because this is all, the crisis is arriving. They're out of time. They need to put IDs in your hand right now. South Korea, I mentioned Asia was being hit among the first of those timelines. And indeed, here are apocalyptic scenes from South Korea, where the government has already started doing a lot of these lockdown procedures, strict vehicle rationing, warning of a catastrophic April supply crisis, desperately trying to shift back to coal, and basically the economy is breaking down. Yeah, that's what happens when you destroy the infrastructure on which civilization is built. Basically, everything was built with the assumption of continuous cheap energy, and that's coming to an end. In South Africa as well, they're 2 weeks away from a fuel disaster. Here from Bloomberg, we can read that about a farmer who needs 40,000 liters of diesel to plant his wheat, but he can only get 6,000 liters, and doesn't know what he's going to do. I mean, it's quite obvious he's not going to be able to plant his wheat. It's another example of the energy crisis becoming a food crisis. Even as the farmers are not getting the supplies they need, the government is actually blaming them for hoarding fuel, which is a response, sort of a gaslighting response out of a lot of governments around the world right now. But it's your fault. It's because you went out and bought all that fuel, and it's even explicitly blaming farmers. And we can add Ethiopia to that long list of Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, all these countries that have started the work from home and the rationing of fuel, Bangladesh. So now Ethiopia is also doing this, encouraging government, in fact, complete getting rid of anybody they don't need, any non-necessary workers from the government services. And then, yes, of course, quote, encouraging the public to conserve fuel, and then granting allocation priority to large public projects and public transport. So they're going to keep their own trains running and force you to give up your car. That has been the plan all along, right? Now, there's a whole series of countries that have implemented these kinds of restrictions, and they're doing it in different ways at different times, but they all mirror the decarbonization agenda and the technocratic goals that have been laid out for some time, and of course the recommendations from the International Energy Agency. So actually, we won't even go through them right now. I think the more important point is just to make sure that everyone knows that what has happened is so severe that none of this can hold a candle to that energy shortfall, and that we are entering a different world going forward, and they will use full advantage of the fact that most people out there are going to feel the pain of this, and they will then accept whatever suite of technocratic solutions is offered them. They will readily take a digital ID if that's how they get the food. They will readily give a thumbprint to get or biometric information just to get their rations. The real solution, of course, is not to do that, is to start growing is to, rather than let the fear drive you further into the hands of the technocrats, rise to the occasion, be inspired to grow your own food without fertilizer. If fertilizer is going away, great, let's grow our own food. Let's do things, let's roll back some of the progress that brought us to this crisis instead of failing forward even into tighter control.